I am Elijah Vance, and I thought I had buried the ugliest chapter of my family's history last Thanksgiving when I threw my son and his wife out of the house I built with my own hands. I thought I had closed the door, sealed it shut, and built a fortress around my grandson so that he would never again feel the sting of their cruelty. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it claws its way back to your doorstep when you least expect it. And this time, it came knocking on Thanksgiving Day, exactly 1 year after the night I evicted my own blood. The day had begun with warmth not cold. The smell of roasting turkey filled my small kitchen. The air carried laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from a child who no longer trembles at shadows. My grandson Leo was setting the table, his hands steady now, no longer the fragile shaking hands I held 1 year ago when I found him freezing outside. His smile had returned brighter than the weak November sun shining through the window. I remember thinking to myself, this is what Rose would have wanted. This is the second chance she prayed for. For a fleeting moment, I believed peace had finally settled on our lives. Then came the knock, a knock that didn't belong to neighbors or friends, a knock too firm, too deliberate, carrying the weight of entitlement. I froze the carving knife still in my hand, hovering above the golden skin of the turkey. My gut told me before my mind could accept it. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door, my boots echoing heavy on the floorboards. When I opened it, the November air rushed in, and behind it came the figures I had prayed never to see again. There stood Marcus, my son, the boy I once cradled in these arms, now a man hollowed out by cowardice. His eyes darted away from mine, just as they had the night I told him to leave. But he wasn't alone. Jessica stood beside him, her sharp smile stretched too wide, polished like a blade, and flanking them a man in a pressed suit holding a leather briefcase. Their lawyer. My blood ran cold. Happy Thanksgiving. Dad. Jessica chirped, her voice as brittle as the frost beginning to coat the porch railing. We thought it was time to settle things. Settle things. The words cut deeper than any knife. I looked past them at the driveway where a sleek black car, idled engine humming like a predator waiting to pounce. They hadn't come to apologize. They hadn't come to reclaim family. They had come for war. Leo appeared behind me, peeking out his face pale. I felt his small hand clutch the back of my flannel shirt, searching for safety. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just another family argument. This was the second act of a battle I thought I had already won. And the stakes were higher, deadlier than before, because they weren't just clawing for dignity, they were clawing for control of my grandson's life and the legacy Rose had left behind. I let them in, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know just how far they would go. As the door shut behind them, the air in the house changed. The warmth evaporated, replaced by a chill that seeped into the walls. They carried with them not just arrogance, but papers, contracts, demands. I could feel it radiating from the briefcase clutched in that lawyer's pale hands. We gathered in the living room, though it felt less like a home and more like a battlefield disguised in holiday decorations. Jessica's eyes roamed around my modest house, her lip curling, as if every picture on the wall, every old piece of furniture, offended her sense of superiority. Marcus sat stiff, unable to meet my eyes. The lawyer began to speak words dripping with legal precision about inheritance disputes, about the rights of the beneficiary, about custodial interference. But the words blurred together, because the only thing I heard clearly was Jessica's sharp interjection. You had no right to take Leo. You had no right to evict us. That house, that money, it belongs to Marcus, and you will give it back or we will take it. Her voice echoed like a verdict. Leo's grip on my shirt tightened. I looked at him, his wide eyes reflecting fear and confusion, and I felt the same rage rising in me that I had felt a year ago when I saw him shivering on frozen concrete. But this rage was different. It wasn't fiery. It was cold, calculated, the kind that doesn't explode but cuts like ice. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands, and let silence stretch until Jessica's smirk began to falter. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady, carrying the weight of every nail I had hammered, every sacrifice I had made, every promise I had kept to Rose. You think you've come for revenge, I said quietly. But what you've really done is walk straight into a reckoning. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Marcus shifted uncomfortably and Jessica leaned forward, her smile sharpening again. Then, reckon with this, she hissed. We're taking you to court. And when the judge hears how you manipulated Leo, How you twisted the trust to cut us out, you'll lose everything. He's our child, not yours. You can't hide behind Rose's file forever. There it was, the name. Rose. Even in death, she was the battlefield they wanted to trample. My wife's foresight, her wisdom, her love, woven into every clause of the trust, was the shield that had protected Leo and me for a year. And now, they were trying to shatter it. I leaned forward close enough that Jessica could see the fire buried in my tired eyes. "Careful," I whispered, "because you don't know everything Rose left behind." And in that instant, I saw at the flicker of doubt the first crack in her confidence. She thought she had all the cards. She thought her lawyer's briefcase carried the final word. But she didn't know the whole story. She didn't know what I still held in reserve. And for the first time since that knock on the door, I felt the ground tilt back in my favor. But I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. Not tonight. Tonight I would let them think they had planted fear in me. Tonight I would let them taste the illusion of control. Because the truth was, they had no idea what storm was waiting for them. No idea that the fortress Rose and I built had deeper foundations than they could ever imagine. So I looked at them, at the son who had lost his spine, and the wife who thought cruelty was strength, and I let a slow, deliberate smile cross my face. "If it's a reckoning you want," I said, "then sit down. Because I'm ready." And that's when I saw it, the flicker in Marcus's eyes, a flash of regret, maybe even shame, quickly smothered by Jessica's hand gripping his. It told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just their fight for money, this was their last desperate grasp at power. And desperation makes people dangerous. So there we were 1 year later, sitting across from each other, once again, the turkey growing cold on the table, the air so heavy with unfinished war that you could taste it. They thought they had returned for revenge. What they didn't realize was that revenge had already chosen its side. Before the courtroom threats, before the icy stares, and the lawyers with briefcases, there was once a boy who ran barefoot through the red clay fields of Georgia and laughed with his whole chest. That boy was my son Marcus. I still remember the way his small hands clutched my calloused fingers when we walked down to the creek behind our first little house. The sun would set in streaks of orange and violet, and he'd throw pebbles into the water just to watch the ripples. Back then, he looked at me like I hung the moon. Back then, I believed nothing could fracture the bond between father and son. I worked long days in construction, hammering nails, laying beams, pouring concrete under the burning southern sun. Every ache in my back, every blister on my palms felt lighter when I came home to Rose's smile and Marcus running into my arms. Rose would hand me a plate of cornbread and beans, her way of grounding me, and we'd sit together around a small wooden table, scarred with years of use. Those meals were modest, but they were rich in ways no dollar amount could ever measure. On Saturday mornings, Marcus and I would build birdhouses out of scrap wood. He'd sit on the workbench in the garage, his little legs swinging, watching my every move, as if I was some kind of magician. "Teach me, Dad," he'd say, and I'd guide his hands steadying the hammer, showing him how to drive a nail without splitting the wood. He always wanted to please me, always wanted to do things right. I saw in him a reflection of my younger self, hungry to learn, desperate to prove I could create something lasting. When he got older, football became his passion. Friday nights under the stadium lights, I sat in the bleachers with Rose cheering louder than anyone else. Marcus was fast, agile, and determined, though not the biggest player on the field. I remember one night he got tackled hard, the crowd gasping as he lay on the ground. My heart stopped, but then he stood up, brushing off the dirt, limping back into formation. That resilience, that stubbornness to keep going, made me swell with pride. After the game, he found me by the fence, sweaty and grinning, and said, "Did I make you proud, Dad?" And I looked him dead in the eye and told him, "Son, you'll always make me proud as long as you keep getting back up." Rose used to say I spoiled him, that I forgave him too easily when he slipped up. Maybe she was right. When he dented the truck trying to drive too soon, I yelled sure, but then I handed him the wrench and showed him how to fix it. When he got caught skipping class, I grounded him, but I also sat him down and explained that life doesn't hand you shortcuts. I wanted to believe that with the right guidance, with enough patience, Marcus would grow into a man who carried both responsibility and compassion. Then came Jessica. I'll never forget the first time he brought her home. She was beautiful, polished, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Rose pulled me aside after dinner, her hand tight on my arm. "She's not like us, Eli," she whispered. "That girl is looking for a lifestyle, not a life." I brushed it off at the time, telling her Marcus was old enough to choose, that Maybe Jessica just needed to see what real love looked like. But Rose had a way of seeing cracks before they became fractures. She noticed the way Jessica barely touched her food, too concerned with appearances. She noticed the way Marcus's voice shifted when he spoke to her, as if he was performing instead of simply being himself. When they married, I stood at the altar with tears in my eyes, hoping my son had found happiness, hoping Rose was wrong. The pictures from that day still sit in a box in my closet. Everyone smiling, everyone pretending this was the beginning of forever. And for a time, I convinced myself it was. Leo was born 2 years later, and I thought surely this is the anchor that will steady them. I remember the first time I held him, so small, so fragile, his whole fist barely curling around the tip of my finger. Rose was alive then, her eyes shining as she whispered, "We get to do it all over again." Eli, but better. She saw Leo as a chance to rewrite the story, to pass on the lessons we had learned through hardship. And for a while, those moments were real. I babysat while Marcus worked long hours, and I watched my grandson crawl, then walk, then run across the same yard his father once did. For a brief window of time, hope lived in that house. But Rose's health began to falter. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap: cancer. For months I watched the strongest woman I had ever known wither, her fire dimming but never going out. On her final night, she reached for my hand, her voice weak but clear. "Protect them, Eli. Protect Marcus, but more importantly, protect Leo. Don't let him grow up forgotten in a house that worships things instead of love." I promised her I would. I sealed it with tears on her hand as the life left her body. That promise has haunted me ever since, guiding every decision, every confrontation. After Rose passed, the distance between Marcus and me widened. He stopped calling about the Falcons or asking for help fixing the faucet. Instead, his calls carried numbers, property taxes, landscaping costs, country club dues. Jessica's influence tightened like a noose around his spine, and I began to see the cotton Rose had warned me about. Still, I wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe that the boy who once looked at me like I hung the moon was still in there somewhere. I started noticing the little things first. Marcus stopped coming by with Leo. Jessica always had an excuse: some gala, some dinner, some important event. I would drive over unannounced just to catch a glimpse of my grandson. Sometimes I saw him playing alone in the yard, a small figure dwarfed by a house too big, too empty of warmth. I told myself not to interfere, that every family has its own rhythm. But inside, I knew something was breaking. The last time Rose's name was spoken in that house was during a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. I mentioned her cornbread, the way she'd hum hymns while basting the turkey. Jessica gave a tight smile and said, "Yes, well, we've moved on from those old traditions. This is a new chapter." Marcus didn't correct her. He didn't defend his mother's memory. He just looked down at his plate. That silence cut deeper than any argument. When I left that night, I sat in my truck for nearly an hour staring at the glow of their chandelier through the window. I thought about how far we had drifted, about how much of Marcus I had already lost to ambition and appearances. I didn't know then that the next Thanksgiving would shatter the illusion completely, that I would find Leo outside freezing, that my promise to Rose would come crashing back with a force I could no longer ignore. Looking back, those were the last days when trust still existed, when I still believed there was a bridge worth repairing between us. I held on to memories of building birdhouses, of football games, of Rose's laughter echoing through our home. I clung to them because I needed to, because admitting the truth that my son was slipping beyond redemption felt like giving up on everything I had built as a father. But the past has a cruel way of being both beautiful and damning. It shows you what was possible so you can feel the full weight of what was lost. And as I sat across from Marcus and Jessica 1 year later, papers spread on the table, threats in their voices, I realized the backstory wasn't just nostalgia, it was evidence. Evidence of a bond betrayed, of warnings, ignored, of a promise made to a dying woman that still burned like fire in my bones. I had loved Marcus with everything I had. I had believed in him. But now, with his lawyer sitting smugly in my living room, I understood that the boy who once asked if he had made me proud was gone. And the man he had become was demanding a reckoning he wasn't ready for. The truth is, the cracks didn't come all at once. They showed up quietly, almost politely at first, like faint hairlines on glass that only reveal their danger when the whole thing shatters in your hands. I told myself not to notice. I told myself every family has rough patches, every marriage has its strain. But denial is a dangerous friend. It lets you sleep while the fire is already crawling under the door. It started with the phone calls. Marcus used to call me about little things: football scores, the price of lumber, a new fishing spot someone had told him about. Those calls changed. The first time I noticed it, he skipped the usual hello and jumped straight into numbers. Dad, the water heater needs replacing and the quotes I'm getting are ridiculous. You think you can cover it this month? His voice was flat businesslike, as though I was no longer his father, but a line of credit. I sent him the money, telling myself it was temporary, that maybe he was just stressed. But then the requests kept coming: the landscaping bill, the new security system, the country club fees. Always dressed up as emergencies, always spoken with that tone that suggested if I truly loved my son, I would help without question. And I did. I pulled from savings from my pension, convincing myself that this was what fathers were for, to make the load lighter. But a seed of doubt had already been planted, and it grew every time he called, without asking how I was, without asking about Leo, without asking about anything but money. Then there were the visits. I used to see Leo every weekend. He'd run into my arms, his hair smelling of shampoo and sunlight, and we'd spend hours building forts out of couch cushions or playing catch in the yard. But the visits grew less frequent. Jessica always had a reason: an important dinner, a weekend trip, a family-only outing that somehow never included me. I began to notice that Leo's clothes were always a size too small, his shoes worn at the edges. I offered to buy him new ones, but Jessica would step in quickly, smiling that smile that never reached her eyes, and say, "Oh no, he's fine. We don't want him spoiled." One evening I stopped by unannounced. It was late summer, and the cicadas hummed loud in the trees. I knocked, but no one came to the door. Then I heard a faint sound from the side yard, Leo's voice. I walked around the corner and saw him sitting alone on the steps, hugging his knees. "Where's your mom and dad, buddy?" I asked. He shrugged, eyes downcast. Later, I would find out they had gone to a gala downtown, leaving him with a sitter who clearly hadn't bothered to check on him. My chest burned with anger, but I swallowed it down, telling myself not to start a fight. That was my mistake. The red flags weren't just about neglect. They were about Marcus himself. The boy who once asked me if he'd made me proud began to avoid my eyes. When I visited, he was distracted, phone in hand, nodding absently while Jessica carried the conversation. He laughed at her jokes too loudly, too quickly, as if he was trying to convince both of us that everything was fine. But it wasn't. His shoulders slumped lower with each passing month, and though I wanted to shake him to remind him of the man he used to be, I kept silent. Fathers convince themselves silence is protection, but sometimes silence is betrayal. I remember one dinner in particular. They had invited me over rare enough in those days. The table was set with polished silverware wine glasses gleaming under the chandelier. Jessica poured the wine, chattering about renovations, about the European vacation they were planning. Marcus sat there nodding, his smile thin, his eyes hollow. I tried to steer the conversation toward Leo's school, his drawings, the way he loved to build towers out of blocks. Jessica waved it off. "He'll be fine. We've hired a tutor. What matters now is positioning ourselves socially. Opportunities don't come to those who waste time on small things." Small things. She meant her own child. She meant my grandson. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, but again, I said nothing. I just looked at Marcus, hoping for a flicker of the boy who once stood proudly in his football uniform, asking if I was proud. But he only looked away. The night ended with Jessica insisting they had to leave early for another event. I watched from the porch as their car pulled out of the driveway, leaving Leo behind with a babysitter who spent more time on her phone than watching him. I stood there in the dark, hands trembling, wondering how far things could slip before they broke completely. And then came the first lie. It was small, almost laughable. Marcus called, asking for money to repair the roof. I drove by 2 days later to drop off tools, only to see a brand new luxury car gleaming in the driveway. The roof was untouched. When I confronted him, he stammered something about timing, about needing the car for work, about how it was all connected. But I saw the truth in his eyes. The roof didn't matter. His family didn't matter. Image mattered. The appearance of success mattered more than the substance of it. That was when the unease turned into dread. I began to check bank records more carefully. I noticed accounts draining faster than they should. Payments to boutiques, to private clubs, to restaurants I had never heard of. I wanted to believe Marcus was just lost, just pressured that Jessica's hand was guiding the spending. but the signature on those withdrawals was his, my son's. And then the most painful red flag of all. It was late November, the first chill of winter creeping in. I stopped by with a coat I had bought for Leo, a thick one with a hood lined in fleece. I knew he needed it. His old jacket was barely holding together. When I handed it to Jessica, she smiled and said, "Oh, we don't need this. He has enough." Later that week, I saw Leo shivering outside, wearing the same threadbare coat, his lips tinged blue. Jessica hadn't given him the new one. She had returned it to the store and pocketed the money. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing Rose's last words over and over again. Protect him. By then, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The cracks weren't cracks. They were fractures running deep, splitting the very foundation of our family. Marcus was slipping away. Jessica was pulling the strings, and Leo was caught in the crossfire. I wanted to believe it could be fixed, that a stern talk, a heartfelt plea could turn things around. But something inside me whispered the truth I didn't want to hear. The next storm would not be avoided. It would break everything wide open. And so I waited. I watched. I kept my promise to Rose in silence, but my silence was running out. Because the red flags weren't just warnings anymore, they were sirens. And sooner or later, they would drag us all into the wreckage. I've lived long enough to know that secrets never stay buried. They rot, and when they do, the stench rises whether you're ready for it or not. I wasn't looking for proof. I wasn't snooping. But fate has a way of putting the truth right in your lap, daring you to pretend you didn't see it. It was late at night, just a few weeks before Thanksgiving, when the first secret slipped into my hands. I had stopped by their house, unannounced again, something Jessica hated. She liked control-scheduled visits, staged appearances, everything polished just enough to convince the world she was the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But that night, the lights were on cars in the driveway, and still no one came to the door. I circled around the side of the house, something I used to do in construction when I wanted to check the foundation before the owners showed me the living room. That's when I heard voices, not from the house, but from the patio where the sliding glass door was cracked open. I recognized Marcus's voice first, low and tired. Then Jessica, sharp as a whip, cutting him down to size. "You think he'll just keep handing us money forever?" she hissed. Marcus mumbled something I couldn't hear. Jessica's response was a dagger. "Don't be stupid. Old men don't live forever. When he's gone, it's ours anyway. But until then, we squeeze what we can. Leo is leverage Marcus. Do you understand that he shows up, he plays the part, and your father keeps writing checks?" I froze the night air colder than anything I'd felt in years. My grandson, a boy with a heart bigger than any house they could ever buy, was nothing but a bargaining chip to them. A tool. My chest tightened, my fists clenched, but I didn't move. I stood there in the shadows, listening as my son stayed silent, offering no protest. His silence cut me deeper than her words. I should have stormed in right then and there, dragged Leo out of that house, and never looked back. But shock does strange things to a man. It locks your feet to the ground, makes you doubt your own ears. I stumbled back to my truck, started the engine, and drove away into the night. My mind a blur of rage and disbelief. The next day I tried to convince myself I had misheard. Maybe Jessica was drunk, maybe Marcus had been about to defend Leo and I had left too soon. But denial was already thin ice, and it cracked beneath me just days later. I was in my workshop sanding down a piece of oak when the phone rang. It wasn't Marcus, it wasn't Jessica. It was their neighbor, Mrs. Gable, the woman who always fussed over her roses like they were royalty. She sounded nervous, her voice trembling as though she wasn't sure she should be calling me at all. "Eli," she said softly, "I don't mean to interfere, but I thought you should know. I've seen Leo outside late at night, more than once, alone, in the cold." The words hit me like a hammer. She hesitated, then continued. "Last week he was on the steps for hours. I almost called the police, but I didn't want to make things worse for him. I thought maybe you should know." I thanked her, my voice steady, though my hand shook as I set down the phone. That was it. Confirmation. Proof from someone else's eyes that my grandson wasn't just neglected. He was being punished, cast aside, treated as less than the things his parents bought to decorate their lives. But fate wasn't finished with me yet. The final blow came in the form of a manila envelope slid under my door one afternoon. No note, no explanation. Just papers. I opened it and found copies of bank statements, credit card bills, and loan applications. All with Marcus's name. All forged with my name as co-signer. My son, my own flesh and blood, had been using my identity to secure loans he couldn't afford, building a castle of debt on a foundation of fraud. I sat there at the kitchen table, the same one where Rose and I had shared countless meals, staring at the black and white proof of betrayal. I could almost hear her voice in the room with me. Eli, she would have said, you can't close your eyes now. You can't wait for this to fix itself. She was right. This wasn't just bad parenting. This wasn't just a weak man led astray by a vain woman. This was calculated. This was deliberate. I tucked the papers back into the envelope, slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, and locked it. My hands shook as I turned the key, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision I knew was coming. Secrets were no longer secrets. They were evidence. Evidence that my son and his wife had traded their souls for a house they couldn't afford, clothes they didn't need, and parties they couldn't stop throwing. Evidence that my grandson's well-being was nothing more than collateral in their desperate charade. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my house, I realized I was standing at the edge of a cliff. One more step, and there would be no going back. I had always told myself I would protect Leo if the time came. Now, the time had arrived, but protecting him meant more than pulling him out of the cold or buying him a warm coat. It meant exposing everything, tearing down the life Marcus and Jessica had built on lies. It meant war. And as much as it broke me, I knew I was ready. Because when a man has nothing left to lose but his dignity and the promise he made to his dying wife, he becomes something far more dangerous than desperate. He becomes certain. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the old house settling. When the first light spilled through the curtains, I whispered to Rose as though she were still there beside me, I've seen enough. It's time. And in that moment, I understood the truth no parent ever wants to face. Sometimes the child you raise becomes the enemy you must stand against. The days that followed were a blur of small storms that built into a hurricane. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And once you hear betrayal in someone's voice, every word afterward sounds like poison. I tried to keep calm, to think like a builder, not a wrecking ball. But even the strongest frame can only carry so much before the weight makes it buckle. Marcus called me again, his voice lined with urgency. He didn't even bother with greetings anymore. Dad, the taxes are due and I'm short. Jessica's stressing out, the accountant says it has to be handled this week. His tone wasn't a request, it was a demand wrapped in desperation. I let him talk, my jaw tight. When he finished, I said quietly, Marcus, when was the last time you asked me how I'm doing? The silence on the line was heavy. Finally, he muttered, Dad, this isn't about you. This is about the family. Then the click of disconnection. That night, Jessica sent me a message herself, written in her polished glass tone, every sentence crafted to cut. Elijah, it's irresponsible to withhold support when you know we're doing this for Leo's future. Do you really want him to suffer because of your pride? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling with fury. Pride. That was the word she used to describe the promise I had made to Rose, the oath that still kept me breathing. I tried to hold the line of patience, but then came the breaking point. It was a Saturday, cold and gray, when I drove by their house again. I should have stayed away, but something in my gut pulled me there. The driveway was crowded with cars' laughter spilling from the windows. Another party. I parked down the street and walked up quietly. And there, huddled once again near the garage, was Leo. His coat was too thin, his breath a cloud in the freezing air. He was clutching a small toy car in his hands, rubbing it between his palms as if it could give him warmth. My heart roared in my chest. I pulled him into my arms, his body stiff at first, then melting into me with a desperation that broke something inside me. Why, champ, I whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I already knew. Inside, the music grew louder, the sound of clinking glasses and hollow laughter, echoing like nails on steel. They were toasting themselves, while their sun froze outside. I marched up to that oak door, the one I had paid for, the one that now felt like a locked vault of rot, and I kicked it open. The crash silenced everything. Every face turned toward me. Marcus, Jessica. Their polished friends' forks paused halfway to mouths. I set Leo down in a chair, wrapping my coat around him. The silence was crushing heavy with judgment and shock. I looked straight at my son, my voice calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. This is still my house. The words were a hammer. Their friends scattered, murmuring excuses, coats pulled tight, unwilling to be witnesses. Jessica tried to smooth it over her voice, brittle. Dad, you're overreacting. It was just discipline. He has to learn respect. I didn't even look at her. My eyes locked on Marcus, who stood pale and trembling, unable to meet my gaze. His silence screamed louder than her excuses. I stayed that night in the guest room, cold and sterile, but I didn't sleep. Every sound of the house, the creak of pipes, the hum of the furnace, was a reminder of the promise I was about to keep. When I walked down the hall and found Leo restless in his bed, his voice cracked when he whispered, "It's not the first time." The confession cut deeper than any knife. Mud on sneakers, broken vases, missed babysitters, each story, another nail in the coffin of denial. I sat there until dawn, watching him breathe, feeling the anger harden into resolve. The next morning I told them plainly, "I'm taking Leo with me for a few days." Jessica's mask slipped in an instant, her voice rising to a shriek. "You can't do that. He's our son. This is our house. You're interfering." She spat my name Elijah as though it was a curse. Marcus tried to mediate, hands raised in his weak gesture of surrender. "Dad, let's talk. Don't be like this. We can work it out." But I saw the truth in his eyes. There was no spine left in him. I packed Leo's bag with steady hands, each folded shirt a silent declaration. When we walked past them, Jessica's face was red with rage, Marcus's pale with fear. Neither of them dared to stop me. Out in the cold morning, my truck waiting like an old warhorse, Leo's hand slipped into mine. That small, quiet gesture gave me more strength than any weapon. As we drove away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, Marcus and Jessica, two small figures standing in their doorway, powerless. They had expected a fight they could twist into victimhood. What they got instead was a clean surgical extraction. But the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. My phone buzzed endlessly with calls and messages, Marcus's voice shifting from pleading to angry to desperate. Jessica left voicemails dripping with venom. "You're destroying this family. You're kidnapping him. You'll regret this, old man. I saved every word, every file. Evidence." When the silence became too heavy, I made the call I had been dreading. "Imani," I said, my voice steady as steel. "It's time to open the Rose file." And with that, the escalation had reached its point of no return. The quiet man they thought they could manipulate had become their judge, their executioner, and their reckoning. I knew what was coming. Legal threats, public confrontations, lies whispered into ears that wanted gossip more than truth. But I also knew this. I had something they could never touch. The truth, the trust, and the unbreakable promise to a boy who deserved more than cold nights and empty words. The day of the meeting arrived cloaked in a cold stillness that felt heavier than any storm. I woke before dawn, the sky outside still black. My house filled with the silence of anticipation. Leo was asleep on the couch, curled under the wool blanket I had given him. His breathing was soft, steady. I stood there for a long moment, watching him, reminding myself why this day mattered more than any I had ever lived. By the time we reached downtown Atlanta, the city was alive with noise, but inside me everything was unnervingly calm. Years in construction had taught me that before a structure collapses, there's a moment of eerie silence, a pause where the weight hangs in the air before the fall. That was where we were now. Imani Perry's office was all glass and steel-polished wood and quiet authority. She met me at the entrance, her presence as steady as bedrock. "They'll be here any minute," she said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, ready for battle. She led me into the conference room, where the long mahogany table stretched out like an arena floor. At one end, a stack of binders and documents weighted every page a weapon. Then they arrived. Jessica first, of course, dressed in a cream suit that gleamed under the lights, her heels clicking with every step like a countdown to war. She wore the smile of someone convinced she had already won. Marcus trailed behind her, clutching a briefcase he didn't need, his face pale and eyes darting like a trapped animal. They looked at me as if I were the defeated one, as if I had finally come to hand them the keys to the kingdom. We sat across from one another, the table between us, wide as a canyon. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the city far below. Jessica broke the silence first. "Well?" she said, placing her expensive bag on the table, as if staking her claim. "I'm glad we're finally being sensible about this. We're eager to finalize the transfer and move forward as a family." Her voice dripped with condescension, her eyes gleaming with false triumph. Imani didn't smile. She opened the burgundy binder with precise movements, her voice cool and professional. "This meeting has been called to review the execution and standing of the Vance Family Trust, specifically in relation to the stipulations outlined in the Family Legacy Clause." She slid a document across the table. "You'll want to read this." Jessica glanced at it briefly, dismissing it with a wave of her manicured hand. Yes, yes, all very sentimental. Rose always had a flair for the dramatic. But let's talk about the practical matter of assets. When does the transfer begin? Imani's gaze sharpened. It has everything to do with it. The trust is conditional. As trustee, Mr. Vance has been forced to evaluate whether those conditions have been met. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. She pushed forward the first piece of evidence. Exhibit A. A sworn statement from Mrs. Gable, the neighbor describing nights she had witnessed Leo left alone, outside in the cold. Jessica scoffed, her voice brittle. That nosy old woman, she has too much time on her hands. She makes things up. Without missing a beat, Imani slid forward. Exhibit B. A medical report from Dr. Evans noting Leo's underweight frame and abnormally high cortisol levels. Evidence of chronic stress of neglect. Jessica's face drained of color. You had no right, she snapped. That's a violation of privacy. As his grandfather and temporary guardian Imani said firmly, Mr. Vance was well within his rights to ensure the child's safety. And the report speaks for itself. Jessica's composure faltered, but Imani was relentless. Exhibit C. A financial audit of 2 years' worth of reckless spending. Country club fees, luxury cars, vacations, shopping sprees, every dollar siphoned from the trust. Marcus flinched at the numbers, his shoulders sagging as though each figure was another stone piled onto his back. Jessica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The mask was slipping, and beneath it was raw panic. Then came the final blow. Exhibit D. Imani pressed play on a small recorder, the room filled with Marcus's own voice, weak and desperate, parroting Jessica's venom in the background. This house is our main asset. It's our equity. You're jeopardizing our future with all this drama. The words echoed like gunfire in the silence. I watched as Jessica's face collapsed in on itself, the confident predator now reduced to a cornered animal. Marcus's head dropped into his hands, shame radiating off him in waves. They had walked in as conquerors. Now they sat, stripped bare, their greed and neglect laid out for all to see. The silence that followed was suffocating. You could almost hear the weight of it pressing down. Finally, Imani spoke, her voice, the calm instrument of judgment. Based on the evidence presented, it is the conclusion of the trustee, Mr. Elijah Vance, that Marcus Vance is an irredeemable breach of the family legacy clause. Therefore, his status as beneficiary is suspended indefinitely. Jessica made a choking sound, half sob, half snarl. Marcus didn't even move. He was already broken. Imani delivered the final strike. As per the instructions of the trust, all assets will be liquidated and transferred into a new trust under the sole name of Leo Vance. Mr. Elijah Vance will remain trustee until Leo reaches the age of 25. The words hit the room like a gavel, final, absolute, irrevocable. For the first time that day, I leaned forward. My voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of 40 years. You have 30 days to vacate the house. The proceeds will fund Leo's future. You will not receive a single dime. Jessica's eyes flared with rage, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. Marcus stared at the table, unable to lift his head. The war was over, and they had lost everything. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was restoration. The law of consequence, a lesson they had tried to teach their son with cold nights and locked doors, now returned to them in its purest form. When I rose from my chair, the legs scraped against the floor, sharp and final. I didn't look back at them as I walked out of that room. I didn't need to. Their silence told me everything. And in that silence, I felt Rose beside me. I had kept my promise. I had protected our grandson. I had rebuilt what greed had tried to destroy. 6 months have passed since that day in the conference room, and sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night, wondering if it was all a dream. But then I hear Leo's steady breathing from the bedroom down the hall, or I see his drawings taped to the fridge, and I know this isn't a dream. This is the life we fought for, the life Rose asked me to protect. The house on Oakwood Drive is no longer ours. It was sold quickly, the profit folded into a trust in Leo's name. The manicured lawn, the glimmering chandeliers, the hollow laughter that once filled those rooms, it all belongs to strangers now. And I don't miss it. Not a day goes by that I regret letting go of that shell of a home. Because a house without love is just wood and drywall, and I've built enough of those in my time to know they don't last. Marcus and Jessica vanished not long after the ruling. At first there were a few calls, Marcus's voice hoarse, trying to salvage something. I listened but said nothing. He wanted sympathy, wanted me to open the door one more time. But the man I had raised was gone, replaced by someone who had bartered his soul away. Jessica's voice came once more, too shrill and venomous, promising that they would rebuild, that they didn't need me or Leo. And then silence. Perhaps they moved to another city. Perhaps they're still chasing the illusion of status in another gilded cage. I don't know. I don't care. What matters is here, in this house, in the small victories that have nothing to do with money. The first time Leo laughed again, a real laugh that shook his whole body, came one Saturday morning while we were making pancakes. He tried to flip one, and it landed on the floor with a slap. He laughed so hard he fell off the chair, and I laughed with him until tears streamed down my face. That sound, it was worth more than every dollar Jessica had ever stolen. His school reports tell the same story. The teachers say he's brighter now, more focused, less afraid to speak up. His drawings have shifted too. Once they were just empty houses, big square shapes with no doors, no windows. Now he draws gardens, trees, people holding hands. Last week he brought me a picture of our family, him, me, and a woman with kind eyes. "That's Grandma Rose," he said proudly. I wanted her to be here too. I had to turn away for a moment, the tears rising too fast. Even in death, she was still with us, woven into the fabric of this boy's spirit. As for me, I've found a strange kind of peace. It isn't easy being both grandfather and father, but every nail I drove in my working life, every wall I raised prepared me for this. Protecting him, guiding him, it's a structure I know how to build. The foundation is dignity. The beams are love. The roof is sacrifice. And unlike the house on Oakwood Drive, this one will not collapse. Sometimes neighbors whisper. They ask if I regret evicting my own son, if I regret cutting him out so completely. The truth, yes. I regret that it had to come to that. I regret that the boy who once asked me if he'd made me proud fell so far. But I don't regret protecting Leo. I don't regret keeping my promise to Rose. Regret is a heavy chain, but dignity, that's the key that breaks it. I've learned something in these months. Legacy is not money. It is not property or inheritance. Legacy is the shelter you build for those who come after you. It's the warmth of a kitchen filled with laughter, the safety of knowing you are loved, the knowledge that when the world grows cold, someone will always open the door. That is what Rose left me. That is what I will leave Leo. Now, as I sit here telling you this, the turkey is in the oven again. Thanksgiving has come full circle. Leo is setting the table, humming to himself, and I can almost hear Rose's voice singing along. The knock on the door that comes this year is gentle, a neighbor dropping off pie, not a war disguised as family. For the first time in a long time, the air in this house is light. I know some of you listening may wonder if I did the right thing, if I was too harsh, too final. But ask yourself this. What would you have done if it were your grandson, your child, your blood left out in the cold? What would you sacrifice to keep them safe? I am Elijah Vance. I am a father. I am a grandfather. I am a man who has lost a man, who has been betrayed, but also a man who has kept his word. And though it cost me my son, it gave my grandson back his life. That is the trade I made. That is the weight I carry. So I'll leave you with this. Legacy is not about what you leave behind in a will. Legacy is about what you build while you're still breathing. The question is, when the moment comes, when the knock arrives at your door, will you have the strength to open it? If you've ever faced a decision like mine, if you've ever had to choose between protecting dignity and holding on to someone you loved, tell me your story. Share it. Let the world know where you stood when it mattered. And if you've made it this far with me, leave a number in the comments. Let it be your mark, your way of saying you stood with dignity too. Because at the end of the day, money vanishes, houses crumble, names fade. But dignity that stays, that's the true inheritance.